Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and WeissAdvice here on YouTube. I'm still on the road, and so I apologize for the construction noise in the background. There's nothing I can do about it, and I really want to make this video because it's an interesting one. So in this video, we're going to be talking about whether or not different DAWs sound different. This is a debate that's been raging on in the internet space for, well, basically since DAWs were created. Do they sound different? Well, in order to understand whether or not they sound different, we have to even define what sound different means, because we could be talking about two entirely different things, right? We could be talking about the intrinsic inherent sound of a DAW, similar to, say, a tape machine. If we pull our multi-tracks into, I don't know, say Reaper, and then sum it down and export it, is there something about Reaper that will inherently sound different than if we were to take those same multi-tracks, pull them into Pro Tools, export them, and then compare? Or we could be talking about the performance of the sound, how things start to sound when they get manipulated, maybe when the levels start getting pushed around, or if we push them into, say, clipping. Is there a difference in the sound then? So there is the intrinsic sound and there is the performance of the sound, and those are not the same. However, we can test them. We can do something called a null test. A null test is a good way to see if two sounds are identical, because if they are, there is a surefire objective conclusion when they are. That is that the sound will completely cancel if the one that we're comparing is flipped directly out of phase, if the polarity is reversed. And this kind of makes sense. The basic principle is this: if you have the exact same sound that is pushing, while the exact same sound has now been adjusted and flipped and is now pulling with the same amount of force at the same time, well, they're going to cancel, right? If we're both pulling on a rope at the same time in opposite directions with the same amount of force, we're not going anywhere. So that's the idea of a null test. Basically, if two things are identical, we can flip the polarity on one and they will completely cancel out. So here's how I've set up this test. I have pulled my multi-tracks for a record called So Rough by Akon and Javor into Reaper here, and I have printed it out. Then I pulled the same exact multi-tracks into Pro Tools and did the same thing. I made sure that the pan depth was -3 on both, and here are our prints. We've got Reaper on top, and we've got Reaper on the bottom. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that the multi-tracks were set at 44.1. The actual sessions were run at 48. So this is not only going to determine whether there's anything intrinsic about the summing of the sound, but also if there's anything that is intrinsically different about the upsampling of the sound. Two places where there could be an inherent difference, sonically speaking. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to solo the Reaper print, and as we go through, I'm going to toggle between the Reaper print and the Pro Tools print, just so if we see whether or not we subjectively hear any difference.
I'm just living till I'm done. So much shit up on my mind. I can't stop now anytime. Death is hot on my behind. Tell them catch up, he behind. I'm not scared of losing mine. Came alone, I leave alone. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. Everything is like a sign. Universe be talking to you off the drugs, you think you flying. You was first to punch shit with me any day before you slide it. It's amazing that I met you. We won't ever grow apart. I'll be damned if I don't bless you. You was with it since the start. All the shit a nigga been through, I don't know where I should start. Running raps all in the dark. Be my case, I beat the odds. Crack a stick a nigga nod. She my dog, she my ride.
So just from doing that subjectively, titling between the two, did you hear any differences? It can be kind of tough to compare because we don't know if we're hearing differences from the actual DAW or if we're simply hearing differences based on where we're at in the song, since the sound is constantly changing every moment. This is why an objective null test is important. So here I am pulling up a trim plugin with a polarity, phase inversion, whatever you want to call it, and I'm flipping the Pro Tools version out of phase. Now what I'm going to do is play them both simultaneously, and if we hear anything, then we know that there is an intrinsic difference in the sound. We don't know what that difference necessarily is. It could be level, it could be timing, it could be some kind of saturation or color, but if we hear a difference, we know that there's some kind of a difference. If we don't hear a difference, then, well, there's no difference. So let's play it. I'm not hearing anything. Doesn't sound like anything's there to me. Well, let's check on an analyzer. Let's make sure that not only we're not hearing a difference, but the analyzer isn't picking up something that maybe we can't hear. that's pretty interesting, right? 80 dB down, it looks like there's a sine wave at about 22 kilohertz. Huh, what would be causing that to happen? What could possibly be the difference between these two sounds that would cause specifically a sinusoidal wave to be produced 80 dB down? Probably the upsampling, because that Nyquist cutoff point is at 44.1. So there might be some kind of a change in that exact upsampling mechanism. I will say this, however. If you can hear a sine wave at minus 80 dB at 22K, you're probably a bat. That is not an easy thing to hear. So for this intrinsic inherent difference between DAWs, I'm going to say it's not really there. There's no discernible difference that the human ear could ever detect, even when we were upsampling, and if we were not upsampling, there wouldn't be any difference at all. Now, spoiler to all of this, well, it's not spoiler, but little disclaimer to all of this, I've actually done these DAW tests before. I've compared Logic and Pro Tools, I've compared Pro Tools and Cubase, I've compared FL and Logic, and I've now compared Reaper and Pro Tools, and so far, given the same set of circumstances where we're just pulling the stems in and pushing them back out, it has nulled every time. So I think it's pretty conclusive. I mean, the science has been conclusive, actually, that intrinsically there is nothing different about different DAWs in terms of just pulling in the stems and then summing them and printing them out. There's no difference in the summing engine or anything like that. Now, where things might get a little bit interesting is when we push our sounds into clipping. When I did this, even though I pushed the same amount, I actually got visually a different result. I could tell even just by looking at things that it was not the same. We can see that the Reaper print, which is this one in red, is actually not as clipped as the Pro Tools version here. So something different was already happening. What I did was I took the Eosis AREQ and used it as a trim plugin, and I pushed it up 8 dB, and then I pushed the master out up another 12 dB, which resulted in about 6 dB of clipping in Pro Tools, but it only is resulting in about 3 dB of clipping in Reaper. So something different was inherently happening there. I went back into Reaper, and I pushed the Eosis, which was functioning just as a trim plugin, basically, up another 3 dB, and I got something where the clipping was reading the same. We're going to compare these, and it's not gonna null. So let's do it here. Pro Tools, this time I'm flipping the polarity on the Reaper print, and this is how it sounded before I made any adjustments. So this was just the same Eosis being pushed 8 dB, and then the master out being pushed 12 dB.
I'm just living till I'm done. So much shit up on my mind. I can't stop now anytime. Death is hot on my behind till I'm.
So we clearly don't need to do any kind of a test to know that that's not nulling, right? That's pretty obvious. How about if we set it with the one that I've pushed 3 dB hotter? So clearly that's not nulling either. And I think what's not nulling is very, very interesting. On the one hand, the actual clip distortion, the breakup sound, is not nulling. That to me is not so surprising, and my feeling is that's not going to be something where between one DAW and the next we're going to necessarily be able to hear a real difference. It's randomized breakup, and I think that even though it's not technically the same, to our ear it's really not going to make any difference whether or not it's, you know, the breakup is happening in certain places versus other places. Right? It's breakup. It's pretty random sounding. But what was interesting is that all of the side information is getting left a little bit. And that to me is going to be an audible difference for sure. So even with the pan depth set the same, once I pushed into distortion, things no longer null. That's very interesting. So in that sense, yes, the DAWs do sound different. Now, again, I don't think it's something intrinsic to the sound, but it's something about the performance of the way that the gain structure is interacting with the pan laws. So what is the ultimate conclusion here? I would say because there's no inherent sonic difference to any, I mean, this is showing just two DAWs, but take my word for it on this one. Really, any DAW, because there isn't intrinsic sonic differences, you're not going to be at any kind of disadvantage using, say, Reaper over Pro Tools. So if cost is prohibitive, or if you feel like you're not getting the results that you want, there's no reason why you can't just work in Reaper. It's not because of the DAW. It's probably because of, I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it, your own skill and expertise. However, that doesn't mean that they will necessarily perform exactly the same when it comes to actually, say, doing something like accidentally clipping, perhaps something when it comes to panning or other forms of gain structure. And so you might find yourself getting results that maybe do, in a certain way, affect your perception of things when you're using one DAW versus another, which again, not necessarily an intrinsic sonic quality, but it might be affecting your perception of the way things sound or the performance of the sound. And so I think that there's a little legitimacy there. I don't think it's so much where you say like Logic sounds better than Pro Tools or Pro Tools sounds better than Reason. I don't think that that really holds up under scrutiny. But at the same time, it might actually explain why sometimes people do hear a difference. So thought that I would put that out there, put it together. Now, if it is your skill and expertise that is getting in the way of you getting the results that you want, well, here comes my shameless plug. You can hop on over to WeissAdvice.com, and that's a website that is very specifically dedicated to getting you better at recording, mixing, and mastering. And it includes not only a bunch of tutorials that you can watch on pretty much every subject involving all of the above, but you also get access to weekly webinars with me, and you also get a discount on one-on-one coaching, plus a whole bunch of other little perks and incentivizers that you can grab, such as trackouts for records that you can mix and use for your reel. So let's wrap up here. If you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at WeissAdvice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.